Emergency! Emergency! Truckers aren't doing what they're supposed to be doing! Emergency! Emergency! Why is Justin Trudeau evoking emergency powers? Hello there, you 5 million shimmering souls. Thank you for joining us on this wonderful journey as we educate one another. You by hitting me up in the comments below, me by reading these fantastic articles. We're so excited to be doing this with you. If you want to come and see me live, I'm all over the UK. You can come see me in Newcastle, Carlisle, Blackpool, Plymouth, Bristol. If you want to see me live, you don't have to, there's no obligation. But what is an obligation is that you don't truck and you do what you're told, because Canada is apparently turning into a tyrannical place. Now, I know there's a lot of people with various views on this. Some people think that the truckers are an extremist movement and that their behaviour is reprehensible, and there's an attempt to try to position it, I believe, as a kind of insurrectionist movement. But I will ask you with an open heart, and I pray an open mind, what plausible protest is permissible? Is it any? What level of disagreement is allowable? Is it any? Let's have a look at what the hell's going on in Canada with Trudeau, who, if you were to judge him solely on his hair, seems like a nice person. But if you start looking at his photo album, it gets a bit more complicated. This is Elliot Kaufman writing in the Wall Street Journal. For Justin Trudeau, emergency powers are too often a policy of first resort. In March 2020, at the start of the pandemic, the Canadian Prime Minister sought arbitrary power to tax, spend and borrow for 21 months. He had already negotiated a COVID relief package with the opposition, but he wanted a blank cheque. Now, as the pandemic seems to wind down, he's returned to the well. He thinks everything's an emergency. Ah! Emergency! Emergency! I've run out of hairspray! Emergency! Mr. Trudeau invoked the Emergencies Act on Monday for the first time in Canadian history. They've got all this way without an emergency. The law's predecessor, the War Measures Act, was only used 3 times: World War I, World War II, the 1970 FLQ crisis involving Quebecy terrorists. Now, in response to protests and blockades started by the truckers against vaccine mandates, the Prime Minister has granted his government extraordinary temporary powers to make orders or regulations that are believed on reasonable grounds to be necessary to respond to the issues at hand. That's how the government explains it on its website. Obviously, you will have already picked up, being an astute, discerning viewer of news and someone who is a philologist, a lover of language, someone who studies words, that is vague language that could be used for anything. Emergency! Emergency! What's the emergency? I can't do what I like whenever I want to and bang people up and nick their bank accounts and freeze their money and prevent people having a conversation. Again, as I always tell you, I have no view on vaccines or vaccine mandates, but what I do believe is that you should have open conversations, and that you will never advantage society as a whole to enter into sensorial spaces of condemnation and judgment, where people in positions of power, whether that's industrial corporate power or governmental power, start closing down and limiting the power of other groups. My personal opinion on the truckers, as long as they remain non-violent and do not express or overtly become racist or in any way unpleasant, you know, I'm about love in the heart. Love in the heart. You know what's in your heart, don't you? You know whether when you're saying something you want to hurt somebody. And I'm saying that if them truckers are doing what they say they're doing, then 90% of them are vaccinated anyway, so take that off the table. They're just saying, we just want some bloody freedom. We were heroes a minute ago, and they're like ordinary working Canadian people. We just want to be able to express ourselves. I agree with their right to do that. This broad authority doesn't junk the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. It does, however, include the power to prohibit travel, public assemblies and the use of any specified property, to force people or companies to render essential services, to impose fines and imprisonment for violating any of the emergency rules, and to use the military as police. If you go back and look at people 5-10 years ago, like people that were considered to be on the edgelands of crazy, they were saying this was going to happen. What I dislike is the kind of rationalisation and minimisation of events that are actually quite radical. The sort of seizure of power, oppression, is evoking like emergency powers that are typically only evoked in situations of global warfare. The kind of war that, please God, will never happen again because, you know, the world's changed, things have altered. What's more likely to happen, and I please don't think I'm pandering to conspiracy theorists, is that centralised powers will coalesce in alignment and in agreement with corporate power to limit the ability of ordinary people to protest about the conditions of their lives. So you should, whoever you are, you should forget what you think. What are they about? Is it vaccines, mandates? Who cares? They should be allowed. They should be allowed. Unless we're dealing with like real serious, deep, almost universal issues of taboo, when we all know what they are, you should allow people to have freedom. Even if you happen in this issue, and I'm like, remember me, I'm open-minded, open-hearted. Even if you agree with Trudeau, good, I want these protests shut down. I don't like it. Some of those people had beards. Like, even if you're totally on that side of it, all over the world, new regulations and legislation are being implemented that systematically prevent protest. And you might say, well, I don't want to protest. Well, let's hope you never need to protest in the future. Let's hope that these centralising technocratic forces never come up with an agenda around something that affects you, because it might do. He says the powers will be used for 30 days. Have we heard that before anywhere? Just for 10 days, just for half an hour. Strengthening the federal police, beefing up penalties, dragooning private tow truck companies, and incredibly directing financial institutions without court orders to freeze personal and corporate bank accounts connected to the protest. If you read, right, just try this as a thought experiment. If you read that was happening in China, wouldn't you think, because I think I would, go like, bloody hell. The only sort of areas where I could conceivably think that would make sense is proven criminality around like the most heinous crimes, and proven terror with evidence, empirical evidence, not protest, not people bibbing their arms. Without due process and used against often caricatured protesters, these powers invite further abuse. Putting aside personal opinions about this particular protest, think about how those powers could be used. And I know they're telling you it's only for 30 days, just a little 30 days. It'll be over by Christmas. We're getting a little used to this kind of rhetoric, aren't we? Trudeau last year denounced anti-vaxxers as misogynists and racists. The irony being that misogyny and racism are wrong because they're simplifications, bigoted generalizations, pejorative and dysphomistic descriptions of a group of complex, varied people. This is not a peaceful protest, Mr. Trudeau says, though in more than 2 weeks there's been no violence. The protests have been highly disruptive to downtown Ottawa and to cross-border trade. But truckers have followed a judge's order that they cease honking horns in Ottawa. Oh, they're not even doing that. And on Sunday, police were able to reopen the Ambassador Bridge connecting Detroit with Windsor, Ontario without incident. Ordinary laws authorise police to clear illegal blockades. Why are sweeping emergency powers needed? Based on just that sentence there, unless this is a lie, what I'm reading in the Wall Street Journal, it sounds like they were asked to stop honking their horns. Okay. And then they were asked to open a bridge to grant access. Okay. Jesus Christ, get the military in! These bastards are out of control! The Canadian Civil Liberties Association states the problem clearly. The federal government has not met the threshold necessary to invoke the Emergencies Act. This law creates a high and clear standard for good reason. The Act allows government to bypass ordinary democratic processes. One of the things of the last couple of years that's been challenging, I believe, for a lot of people is this bypassing of democratic process, usually undertaken with a good deal of compliance because of the acceptance, broadly speaking, that it's an emergency and that it was required. As the situation alters, there should be a symbiotic, obviously, relationship with the government where these powers are rescinded, not where they're increased, because governments like control and power. That's what their job is, the same way Coca-Cola likes sugary brown water. This standard has not been met. The Emergencies Act can only be evoked when a situation seriously threatens the ability of the Government of Canada to preserve the sovereignty, security and territorial integrity of Canada, and when the situation cannot be effectively dealt with under any other law of Canada. That isn't the case, says Alberta Premier Jason Kenney, whose province has seen protests at border crossings. We have all the legal tools and operational resources required to maintain order. Until a few days ago, this was also the public position of Mr. Trudeau's government. As Carson Jeremiah put it in Canada's National Post, in less than a month, the Prime Minister has gone from dismissing the Freedom Convoy as a small fringe minority to invoking legislation that is designed for a foreign invasion or a civil war. This is a small minority, a misogynist and mad racist. Oh my God, this is literally like being attacked by America. The use of language and propaganda here is revealing and demonstrates that there is the use of propaganda and certainly a total lack of transparency. E.g., at the beginning it's described as a small fringe minority. Well, evidently it's not a small fringe minority because they've been able to significantly impact Ottawa and Canadian decision-making process. So they've gone straight to, it's a threat to Canada on the scale of a civil war or a foreign invasion. So it's not the small fringe thing. It's not the invasion. What is it then? Why aren't we transparently discussing what it is? Here's my guess. A large portion of the Canadian population are not happy with the way that Canada is being governed and denied access to democratic means. They're protesting. And because the Canadian government don't want to deal with that protest, they're using legislative language and regulatory measures to dismiss, diminish and undermine the protest. That seems like one of the things it could be. This won't diminish the howls of tyranny from the truckers and could escalate the matter. Even the Liberal Toronto Star called Mr. Trudeau's latest move a shocking admission of failure by governments at all levels. A new opinion poll finds 3/4 of Canadians believe it's time the truckers go home. But polling also finds that many Canadians have sympathy for truckers and others adversely affected by vaccine mandates. Those figures suggest that people are unsettled by disruption, but that is the nature of disruption, while being broadly sympathetic to the cause. That, for me, suggests that a resolution ought be reached. Primarily, that places the obligation in the hands of the government, who have the power to end it immediately, particularly when we're coming to the point where those measures are going to be less restrictive anyway. And maintaining it seems like a symbolic hankering after victory and the expression of power and the appearance of power, rather than regulating a country compassionately with acceptance that people have different and varied views. And as long as those different and varied views don't impact other people in an egregious manner, their freedom should be respected. Ottawa has never offered a clear justification for requiring drivers who sit alone in the cabs of their trucks to be vaccinated. Nor does it make sense for the federal government to threaten to tighten rules for interprovincial truckers, while Alberta and Saskatchewan have dropped their general vaccine mandates and Ontario is set to do so on March the 1st. This is, in a sense, it sounds like from this reporting, a needless confrontation that is not for rational logistical reasons and therefore is symbolic. Backlash from the unvaccinated, vilified, excluded, pushed out of work, barred from Walmart in Quebec's case, shouldn't have been unexpected. When you hear that recited, it sounds to me like a persecution. This is true even in Canada, which was hailed prematurely during the Trump years by the New York Times and the Atlantic as possessing the secret to avoiding populist politics. If there is such a secret, it probably has to do with maintaining public order and not marginalising substantial segments of the population. Anti-populism, for me, sounds like anti-democracy. If people's voices can't be heard, if you are only willing to listen to voices that you agree with, that isn't democracy. That's tyranny. Several protesters told The Observer that the rights they were fighting for were worth any financial hit. Rebecca, who did not want to give her last name, lives near the protests and has joined them regularly. She's been on unpaid leave from her government job for months after a request for a vaccine exemption on religious grounds was rejected. I'm a human rights activist. I don't think that vaccines should be mandated for people to keep jobs, and that's the primary reason I'm down here, she said. Rebecca, mysterious no last name, you fascist QAnon conspiracy theorist. If you've got nothing to be afraid of, why wouldn't you give a last name? Whilst it would be naive to write these protests off as simply an organic expression of legitimate political grievances, it would also be unwise to view them as entirely politically confected or driven by foreign forces or cash. Scott, who owns a farm equipment business outside the city and didn't want to give his last name, will you please give your last names, you conspiracy theorists, said he came to check out the protests with his son. He was sceptical about the decision to paralyse Ottawa, but has concerns about the government vaccine mandates. I think there's an awful lot of Canadians that are very quiet, like myself, on this matter, that probably are more in support, he said. In New Zealand, a convoy of roughly 1,000 protesters converged on Parliament's lawn and its surrounding streets on Tuesday. Not a single politician went out to meet the protesters. And isn't that fundamentally the problem? From the beginning of this convoy, and even prior to it becoming activated, Trudeau has vocally and vehemently condemned the protesters. Firstly, as a fringe minority full of misogynists and racists using pre-existing Trump narratives of deplorables worthy only of condemnation. Then saying that it's an act of civil war. Then evoking emergency powers, then wanting to send in the military. Wouldn't another option be to have a conversation with people, particularly when what the posturing of Trudeau has always suggested is tolerance, compassion, open-mindedness. Oh, this is how you don't get crazy Trump demagogue figures, through these reasonable people that are open and progressive and willing to have conversations. As long as you agree with absolutely everything they say or do and never protest. Here's a crazy idea. How about you get out there and talk to those truckers and say, hey, I may not agree with you on everything. Wouldn't it be crazy if I did? But I respect the difficult work you're doing, travelling around the country and the world, delivering things during that pandemic, hailed as heroes 1 minute, condemned as scum the next when it's convenient. Let's have a conversation. Let's resolve this together. We are, after all going to have to live in this nation, and I'm going to expect you to be tolerant of people that are different from you, from different groups and different backgrounds. So we're going to demonstrate that tolerance right now, because we believe in the principle of tolerance, not just tolerance when it's convenient for us, not just tolerance when we can score cheap points without doing anything about it. Here's the chance to see tolerance in action. Conversation, democracy, freedom, all the things that every flag in the world is supposed to represent could be demonstrated by leaders in this moment. But what do? They hide, evoke emergency powers and send in the guns. There's your liberals. But that's just what I think. Tell me what you think in the comments below. This is a conversation. Hey, I might be wrong. Isn't that crazy? Is that allowed? Are people allowed to be wrong? Let me know. Give us a thumbs up, subscribe, join the 5 million. Join us. Join us. If you enjoyed this video, have a look at this cheeky little guy. Have a look at this guy also, and sign up to my mailing list. I'm touring all over the UK. You can come and see me. Actually, I don't like noise when I'm performing. It puts me off. Come and see me in Newcastle, Glasgow, Plymouth, Bristol. I'm all over the country. There's a link in the description for your tickets. See you there. Stay free.